co-host. I don't know why. I think it's on mine. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. Is Jane here yet?
Yes, I do believe yes. She's here. I don't know why she's not showing on the screen, but she's here.
Oh, great. Perfect. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Do you hear and see me at this point?
Hi, Jane. Good morning. You
Oh.
look great.
Oh, thank you so much. So do you. I was worried for a moment. I logged in with the Hoova app, and apparently it was blocking my microphone and my camera. So I had a moment of panic.
Oh,
Coming in through Zoom did the trick. So hello and good
how are
morning.
you today?
Oh, how about you?
Good, good. All healed, huh?
Yes, exactly.
Perfect.
We hear and see you just fine, both of you.
Mhm.
And people are starting to come in the room now.
Oh, good. Perfect timing. And will we be able to advance the slides ourselves, or do I need to upload them also from my computer?
I made both of you co-hosts, so I think
Okay.
you'll be able to do it yourself. If not, I'll do it for you, but you should be able to.
Okay.
My name's Fran, by the way. I'm an IWAC staff member.
Hi,
Here for you
Fran.
today.
Thanks for all that you're doing. You must be very busy over these past few days.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah, great sessions.
And I guess you know by now, as people ask questions, I'll be taking the small microphone around to the audience. So
Great.
so it may be a few seconds in between, but
Sure.
yeah, I'll be doing that.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you for hosting us.
Well, thank you for being here. Right? Yes, but I
I don't see where to advance the slides on the screen.
It should be just with your up and down button on your computer. Try it and see if it works.
Okay. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be doing anything. What about you, Ritu?
Yeah, it didn't work yesterday either, Jen. Then I
Okay.
did it.
Let's try the clicker. Okay, the clicker works, so I guess I'll just do it for you.
Okay, thanks so much. I can just prompt you as we go
Okay.
along. I appreciate it.
Okay. It is 9 o'clock, ladies, and there are 4 people here, so y'all can start now or wait a few minutes, whatever you want to do.
I'm okay to start. Are you, Ritu?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it. All right, well, thank you everyone for being with us this morning, early on a Saturday for many of us in the Eastern time zone. We have had a wonderful past few days of IWAC sessions, and I'm very pleased and honored to be able to be with you today with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Ritu Sharma. We are both from Purdue University Global, and we teach within the English and Rhetoric department. And we are here today, if you could advance the slide, and we'll show you the agenda, to talk about different ways to foster cross-cultural literacy within the classroom. We will also be talking about examples of transformative writing to learn experiences that are rooted in community engagement. And towards the very end, Ritu, in addition to talking about community engagement, we'll also talk about considering opportunities for engaging students and making them global citizens with an indispensable role in community refinement. So I will start off with talking about the first bullet and dipping a little bit into the second. So before we get into the real content this morning, I wanted to share with you a little bit about our university. On the next slide, we have a little snapshot of some of our recent graduates. So for those who don't know, Purdue University Global is affiliated with Purdue University, but it is an online only college. So our students are enrolled through different geographical areas throughout the country, but also throughout many nations as well. And they don't meet the typical profile of your general fresh out of high school, 18 to 21-year-old college student. In fact, according to recent statistics, the median age of our Purdue Global students ranges somewhere in the 33-year-old to 38-year-old range. As the university begins to draw younger students as well, I think that's dipping down a little bit, but just for context, the oldest student I've ever had thus far was 78, and this was a retired gentleman who had had a successful career, but had never attended college and wanted to do so at 78 years young, which I thought was really admirable. And the youngest student I've had thus far, I think, was 16, and this was a high school student attaining AP credit. But the majority falls somewhere within that big spectrum. A significant portion of our students are bilingual or multilingual, so they are English language learner students. And we have a significant growing number of students enrolling who are international students as well. And as a side note, not on this slide, but worth mentioning, we have a significant military enrollment as well. So we have many students that, while American in origin, may be stationed in other nations and joining us there. Many of our students are first generation students, the first in their families to attend college. Many are students who have been ensconced in careers for quite some time, but maybe advancing within those careers or starting a new one. And COVID was certainly a turning point for many people as they begin to reevaluate their current careers and what they really wanted to be doing with their futures. And I've taught at many different kinds of universities, from private colleges like Columbia University, where I got my training as a teaching fellow, to Colby College in Maine, to also University of Maine and University of New Hampshire. But honestly, I do have a special fondness for the virtual education that we do at Purdue Global because of the diversity of our student population and the fact that they understand what's at stake with their college education. They understand the sacrifice that they're making with their time, with their money, and they have very specific goals. I recently asked students in my college composition class what had persuaded them to enroll in college, because as we'll see, my focus in teaching is primarily on persuasive writing. And the responses that I got, money was certainly a big motivator, but more specifically, finding a more fulfilling career, finding more security for their families. Some mentioned making their children proud or being good role models for their children, which again, these are all such honorable goals, and I think make our population of students really specific. So they come in with these kinds of goals and these kinds of understandings of what it is specifically that they wish to get from their college education. One last thing that I think makes our university rather unique, we do conduct live weekly seminars in Zoom, as it were, so they do get to see us, but students have the option of whether or not they share themselves on camera. This is not something that I enforce in my classes because many of our classes are held at night. I'm assuming that some of them are comfortable at home in their pajamas, and I don't want them to feel self-conscious. But because of that, we often don't know what our students look like. For instance, we might have a student named Chris Jones enrolled in our class, and we don't necessarily know what gender Chris is, what cultural background Chris has. But over the course of the 10-week terms that we have, we do get to learn quite a bit about Chris, specifically through the writing and the ideas that they share. And many of our students do disclose quite a number of things about themselves. So on the next slide, a little bit about my purpose here today, and speaking for Ritu as well, our shared purpose. We both teach in the Department of English and Rhetoric at Purdue University Global, as I mentioned. And I generally teach Composition 2, which is our persuasive writing course, a course that Ritu is very familiar with as well. And so I'm often thinking about how the course that we teach helps students within their future and present careers, and also, of course, thinking about writing across the curriculum, how that helps them in other courses. And in so doing, I'm often thinking about how to invite further thinking about the power of persuasive communication across different cultures, and also in doing so, how to foster effective cross-cultural communication. And when I talk about cross-cultural communication today, I'm talking not only about we as faculty being sensitive and open-minded to the variations of our students, but also modeling for our students how to have that sensitivity and respect and appreciation amongst each other. So on the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about the locus of our persuasive communication and how we attempt to foster cross-cultural communication in Composition 2, which I think a lot of you in teaching in other disciplines will see some carryover in what you do as well. So in Comp 2, we have a major task, which is an idea for change essay. This is a persuasive essay, which is due towards the end of the term, in which students work incrementally towards starting with topic selection, moving on to thesis, and then examining many different parts of the essay itself. And what students are asked to do within this task is to think about a specific proposal for change that they would like to see within their community or within their workplace. So for some students, thinking critically on this level, depending on their educational background and their cultural background, is immediately challenging because in some cultures, students are not invited to delve into their opinions and to deep analytical thinking of content, but rather to show their mastery of content. So we have to be mindful of that. Usually early in the term, this is where many students will disclose if they are English language learners. Oftentimes they will share where they are from, and this is something that I invite people to talk about in our first session. So we usually do have some fairly good indication of some of the cultural differences the students face, and we learn more about that as we go along further in the course. But on the next slide, since I mentioned that the idea for change is about community, I wanted to define what we mean specifically when we talk about community within the context of this task. So community, I tell students, can mean a lot of things. It's essentially any group of people that has shared interests, whether that be special interest groups, one's neighborhood, one's city, or one's town, perhaps a marginalized group of people. It could be an online group of people. It could be a professional group of people. The list can go on, but in a nutshell, as long as there is the element of fellowship, shared characteristics, shared interests, and common ground to be had, then we can define that as a community. So what students are asked to do is to really think about not only a problem that they would like to see corrected, in which they could propose an actionable plan for correction, but also think about different stakeholders that would have a vested interest in this proposal. So that would mean people who are on board with the proposal and people who potentially might have some opposition or some misgivings or some concerns about it. So thinking about some of the cross-cultural differences and how these come into play as we think about community and we think about identifying problems to solve, on the next slide, I have some information that is probably familiar to many of you, but which I always find interesting, and I'm continually reading about this, which is the fact that we have throughout the world what we refer to as high context and low context cultures. Low context cultures tend to be more of what we experience here in the United States, North America, and parts of Western Europe. By nature, we tend to be very direct communicators and rather explicit in how we express ourselves. Whereas in the high context cultures, which we see more in Asian and Arabic cultures, parts of Europe, and so on and so forth, the communication is more subtle. There is shared meaning. These cultures tend to be more collectivist and homogenous in nature. For instance, Japan, which is a high context culture, is 98% Japanese. So consider that for a moment. The Japanese live amongst people who are very much like themselves, and in more homogenous communities, there's a lot more subtext, and people get the gist of what one another is saying sometimes through nonverbal cues, through what is unsaid, perhaps more so than we might see in a culture like America that tends to be comprised of many different kinds of people. So it's important to be mindful as an instructor of the fact that we often have high context communicators and low context communicators housed within the same classroom. So how are we mindful and respectful of these communicative differences and at the same time promoting understanding and respect between these people who communicate very differently? Going back to the assignment that we work with for a moment and onto the next slide, as we think about a proposal for change, this is a very simple breakdown of what our students essentially are asked to do. They think about the community problem that they wish to address. They think about who potentially could be in the position to implement or catalyze that change, in addition to specific turnaround actions that could or should be taken. And to my thinking, perhaps the most important, the cause and effect relationship at work here, which is why should the change take place? In many other classes throughout universities, this kind of problem solving is present, thinking about changes and actions and corrections, whether it's done in persuasive essay format or not. So I think that this exercise that we do in our classes is applicable to a variety of other writing situations as well. And I always invite students to think about if they could wave a magic wand and think about what they wish could be different in their community of choice, what would they like to see? So I have a couple of examples of recent thesis statements on the next slide that students have shared in my classes. I'm sure Richie has seen many other fascinating examples as well. First of these two examples was from a student who wrote about the Zambia school system. And you can see her thesis here, which states that there should be an accreditation of vocational educational training in order for youths from low-income households to achieve higher education that's affordable, easily accessible, and offers on-the-job experience while studying. Now, the majority of the students did not necessarily know a lot about what it's like to go to school in Africa. In this particular class of, I think it was 34 students, this happened to be the only student enrolled who was from an African nation. But usually we do have quite a few and sometimes more than one in one class. So this was a learning experience for the entire class. And people found a way to connect to this topic because through the students' research and personal experiences that she shared, we all learned that schools in Zambia are in many ways not completely unlike schools in the United States. Many students were surprised, for example, to learn that there is essentially an equivalent to an elementary school, a junior high school or a middle school and a high school, and that many students do go to college as well. And just like in the United States, the effectiveness, I should say, of the education is often affected by poverty. So there are certain areas of Zambia where the quality of education is better and the quality of education is worse, depending on finances, sadly, much like we see in the United States. And I think by being able to make connections to a nation which is foreign to so many of our students, that was a wonderful opportunity to come together cross-culturally and understand that there is a lot of shared meaning and a lot of sameness across different cultures. In the second example, this was a student who was part of the Yavapai tribe, which is rooted in Arizona, I believe in the Maricopa County region, which is outside of Phoenix. And this was a very interesting thesis. It happened to be close to Thanksgiving time when the student came up with this topic. And her idea, as we can see, was that her nation should stop embracing belief practices that go against her indigenous beliefs and principles. Now, this topic was quite a revelation to many students. And again, the student was the only indigenous person in this particular class group. So we learned a great deal from what she shared. And while I'm sure it was uncomfortable for those of us who are non-Indigenous at times to hear about the injustices that white people had put upon the members of her tribe back in the day, and her understanding of what Thanksgiving meant to the people of her tribe, as well as what is taught in history books and how this does not properly represent her culture, it was an important learning experience for all of us. And all of the students were able to communicate with her in an appreciative and respectful way and offer suggestions to help her strengthen her thesis and strengthen the research that she did for her topic. So the work that students do in their classes not only give them an opportunity to promote aspects of their culture, but to think more critically about facets of their culture and most beautifully of all, I think, educate their fellow classmates and their instructors on different features of their cultures. And we as instructors have the role of being able to moderate and facilitate all of this discussion to ensure that all cultural beliefs expressed are respected, that judgments are not passed, and that it's a safe environment in which students can discuss, explore, and share such arguments. So on the next slide, I mentioned earlier that we do talk in these classes about stakeholders, audiences, purpose, and common ground, all of which I think foster cross-cultural communication and cross-cultural literacy. On the next slide, a very important aspect, one of my favorite aspects that we teach and that we talk about, and again, a very important concept in virtually any discipline, is being aware of a rival hypothesis, right? So the rival hypothesis, otherwise known as the counter argument or the opposing view, urges students to think about other perspectives beyond their own thesis and assumption, because of course, having that awareness makes our own argument stronger as we think about how to preemptively address such concerns. But this process of thinking of rival perspectives at times can be difficult for some of our students who come from cultures that place a high value on group harmony and collectivist thinking. Some of them are not comfortable with the concept of debate because they see that as being unharmonious, shall we say, or even social failure. So early in the term, as we think about this, we have to think about ways to package debate as a healthy and necessary academic exercise, which is not about winning and not about failing, but rather about shared meaning with the outcome of all parties learning at the end. And generally, when it's pitched that way to them, they become much more comfortable with the process, and many of them become some of the stronger debaters and academic arguers within the class. So on the next slide, just a little bit further in terms of some of my experiences in the classroom, a couple of examples. I have so many, and I was just trying to think of a few that encompass the spectrum of some of the different cross-cultural representations that we've seen in our classes. When I used to live in Maine, I now live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but when I used to live in Maine, Maine is one of the refuge states for Somali refugees. And I used to have a large number of Somali students. And when I taught persuasive writing, I had many students who were eager to share different aspects of Somali culture. Sadly, for many of the refugees, there were misconceptions from some people in the community, especially the smaller communities, that they were getting a free ride from the state, that many of them were not motivated to work. And many of them shared arguments that talked about the work ethic of the Somali people, their hardworking nature, their enterprising spirit, and the growth and culture that they brought to Maine. And in sharing these arguments, it really, I saw, broadened the perspective of other locals who hadn't necessarily thought of this very special community in these terms. Another group that I see represented sometimes has talked about things like arranged marriage. And I specifically had a Korean student from a conservative rural area of Korea recently. And while this wasn't the topic of her paper, somehow the topic of arranged marriages came up in class and spawned an interesting side discussion as she talked about the fact that in her culture, arranged marriages are quite common, and they have begun to evolve. Of course, in some cultures, women have very little say in how arranged marriages are conducted, and they often get the short end of the stick. But even in many cultures where arranged cultures still exist, they've become a bit more progressive. Some use dating apps even to assist with that process. So she talked a little bit about how in her culture, arranged marriages is a rather favorable thing. And this was an interesting point of communication in a class of largely American students where we have, for better or for worse, the power of choice within our marriages at, of course, a 50% failure rate. but it's certainly got students thinking and talking differently about something that many of us take for granted, which is the freedom of choice in our relationships and in our marriage. So lastly, before I pass the torch on to Ritu and her portion of the presentation today, I just wanted to share some thoughts, final thoughts on practices on the next slide. Some practices to think about within your own classrooms to foster cross-cultural communication. One thing that I won't say a lot about at the moment, but which is a forward-looking item, is that I know at our own university, we're really beginning to rethink standard English and standardized American English and how we define that. A lot of rubrics, older rubrics, identify that writing tasks should be written in what we call standard English, but I think with the times, we really need to think about what that is going to mean for us. And perhaps that will simply be referred to as English. I think that would be much more agreeable for all parties. In our instructor communications, also, we should really think about clarifying language that we should use, taking cultural differences into account, remembering that students in some cultures may take directives very literally. They may not understand idioms, for example. A quick anecdote. I had a student some years ago who was from the Sudan. He was a very sweet young man. And sometimes I have a bit of a sarcastic way about me. And I had students turn in work late the week before. A lot of students turned in work late. And at the end of the class, I said, it would be wonderful if all of you turned in your next assignment on time. And he approached me in his very sweet way at the end of the class. And he said, Professor, you said that it would be very nice if we turned in the next assignment on time. Does that mean we don't have to? And I got a little chuckle out of that. And I thought, of course, that he was taking that message literally and wondering, was I giving them an option? But no, in fact, that was just me being a bit sarcastic, which didn't necessarily translate well in that instance, but that was a great learning experience for me. We should always model positive responses and positive communications. In our classes, we have discussion boards in which we can always come in and students follow our lead in terms of how we communicate. So if we're responding positively to something, students will generally respond in kind. And lastly, highlight examples of different cultural experiences and learning, and be respectful of cultural differences and avoid cultural related value judgments. One of the more challenging instances of this, I'll say, imparting is last semester, I had a student who was from a culture where she informed the class fairly early on that in her culture, women usually don't have much of a say in things and follow what men do. And I thought, this is very interesting because she's presenting this idea in a class full of women who have been raised very differently, right? So I essentially said that to her, and I said, well, other people in the class, of course, have been raised very differently, where women are on equal footing and have equal careers and very much an equal say to men. But it will be quite interesting to hear your perspective and experiences this term. We are all going to learn quite a bit from you, right? I could not unravel her entire value system in the entire 10 weeks that we have together. And I don't know that it would even be correct for me to do so, but I did make her aware of our differences, and in speaking to her in this way, showed the other students that we were going to be respectful and listen to what it was that she would share throughout the term. So that is my portion of the presentation. I'm delighted to pass along the rest of our time to Dr. Ritu Sharma, who has some wonderful ideas to share with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Watson. A very happy Saturday and welcome everyone. What a pleasure it is to be here And Dr. Watson, she did introduce me. My name is Ritu Sharma, and I am a professor. I teach in English and Rhetoric Department, and so happy to be here today. So the very first slide, but before I get started, I was I was just smiling when she talked about arranged marriage because I am somebody who had gone through that. So I was born and raised in India, and only thing I knew was my books, nothing else. I wasn't street smart at all. And by the age of 17, I am rather tall for an Indian girl, so I would get a lot of attention. Parents would get proposals for arranged marriage. And my parents one day showed me a picture and looked like a mugshot, and I started crying. And so my mother said, take some time, don't rush. You are lucky. There are parents of daughters who wait years and years, hoping that somebody would choose their daughter. You are very lucky that, we are getting too many proposals. I had just finished my bachelor's and gotten a teaching license, and I had sought admission master's in English because master's there was like a status symbol. If you have master's in English, everyone would look at you differently. It's sort of a class system. And even today, sometimes when my students say, "Hey, Dr. Sharma, please take it easy. English is my second language." And I say, "Hey, my dear rock star, guess what? If I can come from a village where English is the eighth official language and teach that here, you already have an upper hand in life." And they would laugh about it. So I was given 1 month out of 5 mugshots to choose one, and I called my best friend, and we both cried, and then she chose one for me. And the good thing was he had a master's, so parents thought that he would be wiser and mature, and he was 9.5 years older to me. Got married. I started teaching in a high school, and the fourth day after marriage, got two of my ribs broken. So it was a um, terrible arranged marriage. But my pride was so dear to me. I did not share it with my parents that, hey, I am getting beat up. And I went to their house and I had like a blue black eye, and mom asked, and I smiled and I said, I'm trying to learn how to ride a motorbike. And that's why this happened. And then I gave birth to my older daughter. And actually, my father had retired as a colonel from Army, and this was the border of India, Pakistan, where his last posting was. So that's where I was married. It does not signify that entire India is nothing like that. It does not reflect that, just that one little community. So gave birth to the older daughter to realize he doesn't want girls. Well, by the time then I finished my master's, I was a valedictorian and then got into the PhD program. Gave birth to the second daughter, same guy, same formula. 3 years later, another daughter on the way. He was just livid. And I remember I came back from the university, and 3-month-old baby had like a bruise on the cheek, and I knew what it was. Back then, divorce was 0%, and today it's 1%. And I never dreamt, I never dared ever to think about divorce. That wasn't something that people would talk about. So I asked him if I could teach overseas. He's like, sure, just send me more money. I'm like, yes, I would. And took me 2 months to get a job in Dubai. So my first job out of India was in Dubai, and took both my girls. Older one was 3.5 years old, the younger one was 5 months old. And just both my daughters and I, and then I taught country to country to country. I was so blessed. 23 years back, The guy upstairs answered all my prayers. And I remember in Houston, there was a job fair, and I came just to attend that. And in 2 hours, got 7 teaching positions and signed 7 contracts. I thought, what if they change their mind later? And so started teaching in Houston. Now I'm here in Cleveland, Ohio. After 2 years, I was invited to present at Case Western Reserve University, so got a job there. And so thankful, especially to the students who fend for our country, the ones who are deployed. I mean, it is because of such selfless professionals we have a country the way it is. And I understand not everything is hunky dory, but still very happy to be here living my dream. And the daughter he did not want, she is 25 now and a neurosurgeon. And the older one who got tons of slabs, she works for NASA as quality specialist. So I often think of it. If they were in India, they would be in arranged marriage with children, all the responsibilities that they did not know what they were signing. And this wasn't part of the presentation. And Professor Watson said, and I just thought, gosh, is she sharing my story? So I worked for the city council. I was president of city council. So everything I could have never dreamt of happened because of this country. And it is such an honor and delight to be working with Purdue now for 16 years. So here we are, this foresighted educators. We are the drivers of this global citizenship. What can we do to ensure that it's not about a region, it is not about one micro level, even though our thesis, we do tell our students to start at a micro level manner, to focus, to sharpen the focus, to chisel that concentration. But finally, the point is to be able to create these well rounded global citizens. So, from regional to national to global, and I did not choose to make them global citizen. It just so happened over the years, the ones who are immigrants, the ones who have roots somewhere else, or the ones who are deployed, we give them a choice. They have to pick one problem, whether it is rooted in their community, workplace, or connected to their major. And 90% of the students would pick something trying to make their little corner a better place, and they would pick something from the community. And I have students deployed, so all the different perspectives come on the table. So I would like to talk about amplifying this global citizenship in a classroom, fostering this interconnected world, which did not seem so interconnected a couple decades back. But today, it's just a different platform. So the session would investigate the attitudes, the knowledge, behaviors of students toward global issues, cultural diversity, and that responsible global engagement. It will concentrate on this process to expose the multicultural experiences that influence the development and promotion of this citizenship and leading to fostering some sustainable development. So the session welcomes and challenges the attendees to investigate this concept a bit further, analyze the complexities, just like Professor Watson spoke about, and identify avenues for promoting that understanding, that accountability, that citizenship. So I draw on Dr. Banks' article, Equity Pedagogy, where, so it's Banks and Banks, where they talk about multicultural education and how it explores the concept of this equity pedagogy and the significance within the framework of education. So it's crucial for creating these inclusive, effective learning environments that address the needs of diverse students. And I'm thinking 15 years in this country, I never told anybody that it was arranged marriage. I never told anybody that I dared rebel in a way that I came here and got myself away from the situation, got both my daughters away. But it is thanks to the system here that can make us so comfortable that we don't have a problem after all these years sharing certain facets of life. So banks emphasize just having diverse students in the classroom. That is not enough. That's just a good start. But we as educators should employ those pedagogical, eudagogical, andragogical strategies to promote equity, to facilitate this academic success, which does not end with graduation, which goes all the way, which helps them in their careers as well. So this takes us to our next slide that talks about equity pedagogy. So the purpose of this segment is to explore and execute that concept of global citizenship, talking about that world where we need each other, we collaborate, and the attitudes, the knowledge, behaviors of our students. Because students, again, sometimes they are shocked. Professor Watson talked about Zambia, and that reminded me I had a student serving in the Marine Corps, and he wrote a paper about the Zambian embassy and how difficult it was for an American soldier to go there and to start protecting without even really understanding the inner culture. I have had students in the past deployed in Afghanistan, and I remember one student took a picture of this card he said he would have to carry, and it said in Dari, in Pashto, in different Afghani languages, that, hey, I'm sorry if I mess up or if I do not respect your culture. I am an outsider. I don't mean to hurt you in that manner. I am only trying to respect your culture, so please forgive me. And I was stunned. And I thought, here you are driving in this Humvee with this AK 47, and what a juxtaposition holding this card. Like, how super thoughtful it was for whosoever the committee that came up with those cards translated. And I asked him, I'm like, did you know initially what it was? He's like, we have so many things that we had to check off. This was a very small thing. He's like, I really didn't think much about it. But then he's like, when I would see the Taliban struggling or in the battlefield dying. And he thought, I would often wonder, here I just shot him and now I'm going to show him the card that, hey, I respect. So the point was that idea of understanding, of outreaching. But I thought in this particular situation, it wouldn't matter. It wasn't going to be friendly fires, generally speaking. So here, the inclusive education, the multicultural awareness, the social justice. And then again, not that I want to draw on the military experience, but the ones who are serving or my veteran students, they always come back with that nostalgia. And they say, we were there to make it better, not sure. And I am not sufficiently equipped to answer those questions. And it's just a reflection that probably my students and I, we do as we collaborate. We have learning activities, we have projects, and there's cross-cultural exchanges where they collaborate, appreciate the value of diverse perspectives, and they understand. this sense of agency, because they have two choices. Either you come to the class with tons of problems and be this vulnerable, miserable student, or you take accountability of whatever little bit you can do. You join hands with the different stakeholders in the community and you create a positive change. So, kind of like a service learning project. And they do that. They go to the school board of education, they go to the city council, they even take a draconian, archaic policy to the company commander through the right channel. So, all those positive changes. So, authors here talk about involving the different teaching methods that acknowledge and build upon these cultural backgrounds, experiences that our students go through, and how these relevant materials provide opportunities for students to engage in more cooperative learning, in critical thinking. What I have witnessed is many times students would say, "What do you think, Dr. Sharma?" And I tell them, "No, you don't want to know my 18th century ideas. Share your 21st century ideas. Don't wait to be spoon fed, so to say, but be open to carry on this intellectual discourse." So, this equity, pedagogy, and practice, cooperative learning, collaboration on projects, and instructional resources that help us reflect as well, they certainly go a long way. And here, these authors argue that how this pedagogy goes beyond individual classroom practices. It requires systematic changes within the educational institutions. And they propose that how we should adopt this curriculum framework that promotes multiculturalism, that promotes globalism across the subject areas. And I'm thinking, so many years back in Singapore, I taught for international baccalaureate program that some schools are starting now here in US. And I'm thinking it was already in Southeast Asia back in the day in full bloom. So the next slide sheds light on cooperative learning. And many times I tell my students that they're like, "Well, are you sure this is what? Or do we have to?" And the ones who are attendees, my other students during seminar, I would tell them, you have three ways to demonstrate engagement. As students, you can ask questions, you can answer each other's questions, or whatever is on the slide, you can break it down in your own words for your classmates. And when they do that, I have seen this magical effect. It doesn't make much sense to some of my students when I say it, but when it comes from their peer, they are more receptive. So this shared responsibility, whether it's of text, whether it's of outcomes, the results, and this problem solving, that sort of a mindset. And when I ask them to narrow down on one issue, many times I have students who say, "I have 10 of them. I don't know which one to pick. All of them are equally compelling." And I tell them, "You are lucky. You are here in US and you are talking about 10 issues, because in some other part of the planet, you'll be inundated. You would not even realize that these 10 issues are anywhere in the spectrum." So we have a very interesting conversation talking about interdisciplinary connection, this cross-cultural communication. And I would like to share Dr. Linda Flower. She is a professor and a director at Carnegie Mellon, and we use her articles. She talks about being this voice of the voiceless. She talks about intercultural rhetoric. and how every day there are people struggling to understand whether it's social justice, ethic, a strategic practice. The other day I read somebody got in trouble. Cops got hold of them in New York, and this was one family who came from Africa and were forcing genital mutilation on their daughter. I also remember my daughters here would ask us, we don't have to date, mom would arrange marriage for us. And I said, no, that was the whole reason mom ran away from there. But just because something that has happened in the past or it has happened in one culture, and if it is not a positive thing, not it doesn't mean that we need to continue with that. And that reminds me when I became citizen, besides they had a little test. So there were two. One were 100 questions of history. That's the one I was scared of. Another one was English test. That's the one other immigrants were scared of. And I told them I'm a professor of English, but still I had to say a few sentences the way they wanted to prove that I had that understanding of language. And the other 100 questions, both my daughters, they were not interviewed being minor. I got the citizenship and then I applied for them and they got it. But they knew the answers for history because they learned history here in the United States. I had no idea who the third president was, who the 12th, and I had to memorize just for the sake of that particular test. And there was a very important, fascinating, critical component. When we take pledge, they ask us to take an oath and to work toward anything that might be negative in society. And I always thought that they place more responsibility, just probably trying to assimilate the immigrant population. And like Professor Watson was saying, I take everything literally. And that was the reason that I wanted to serve on the council, and I did it for over a decade. So just and then this course does exactly the same, finding one issue and trying to overcome, trying to be part of solution team. Also, Dr. Flower talks about drawing out voices of the silenced, expertise of the marginalized people. Just because somebody looks different, talks different, that we cannot get into hasty generalization or a fallacy and think, oh, they don't know any better. And my students, I have right now in the current term, I have one student from Indonesia, and I have another one from Middle East. And the Middle Eastern one, she would say, Dr. Sharma, you know better. Back home, they ask me a question, my male counterpart has to answer that. And I tell her, welcome to US. You have equally the power to be able, because initial seminar, she did not earn points. And that's when she sent me an email saying that she wasn't comfortable asking or answering questions. And I said, well, then whatever is on the slide, break it down, share that with your peers, and just helping. And that reminded me of Dr. Flower. Draw people normally separated by whatever conflict or contradiction, by these differences, into new roles as partners in inquiry. So recognizing this difference and then creating that change. So community literacy, I quote, she says, is a working hypothesis of how we might construct a community that supports dialogue across difference. And I often tell my students, reflect, think about it, open the communication channels that were previously closed. And many would say, oh, I have stopped talking to my aunt ever since last Christmas. She is a mean person, or whatever the family dynamics might be. So, this, and they say, well, we talk about dialogue across the community. And I practice it myself. Some people can be difficult in family. And how do we have a meaningful, purposeful dialogue across this difference? So it really crystallizes the significance of global impact by acknowledging the existence of contradictory agendas, conflicting voices, and this urgent need to engage with the different perspectives. So it promotes that inclusive approach that respects and values diversity while encouraging dialogue and understanding across cultural differences. So the next slide talks about this power of conviction, persuasion, and cross cultural communication. How we as educators can utilize content materials to accommodate every single student in the class. And I tell them, all of you have a voice and have a choice, no matter where you came from. So, different diverse texts. There are whether it's books, articles, videos, materials that highlight different cultural backgrounds and histories. And we delve in it early on in Unit 2, where I share Dr. Linda Flowers' works with them and also ask them to pick a TED talk. And I tell them it's not a guy, it's not a bear like some of my students might think, and how they get so enticed by TED Talks, and some of them would download um, and use it every time they are driving, listening to that. So the multicultural examples, the case studies, integrating those, we see some great results because, again, we are able to relate it to our students' experiences. My student who came from China, and she said, Dr. Sharma, my actual name is really difficult. Just call me Mary. I said, no, I would like to call you by the unique name that has been chosen. Help me pronounce it right. And because I started, I saw a little shift, and classmates started using the real name during the discussion boards. And I'm thinking my first name, Ritu, it comes from Sanskrit, stands for spring season. That's when I was born. And I was so upset with my parents because I would tell them that, why did you not name me Rita? I have students thinking my parents didn't know English and they messed up the spelling. Or even if it's like my personal email I would give and I would say Ritu, they would automatically change it to Rita and I would never get that email. But the school email is a little different. Don't have to write the entire first name. So just thinking about all these various situations and experiences and finding this shared purpose, this relevance, enabling each other to exchange ideas, working toward this common goal. And we incorporate various instructional approaches. It can be visual aids, hands-on learning, group work, discussions, and then the most fascinating one that I am in the process of grading is our multimodal presentation. Some student might not be an A plus writer, but they might be super creative and craft this wonderful presentation based on their idea of change. So, being adaptable, being open to professional development, and sharing ideas, that does happen. And finally, reflecting. reflecting on it. And this other strand is of immense importance is building positive relationships. How it helps, whether it is educator to educator, student to teacher, how this contribute to the emotional, social well-being of one another, this feeling of connection, and it enhances the student's self-esteem, motivation, and overall their mental health. They are comfortable asking questions, taking risks in their learning, the feedback that they get. And we spend a lot of time talking about not just feedback, but also feed forward. Okay, this went wrong here, but moving forward, how we can fix that. So it ends up with some long term teaching impact. So the next slide talks about evaluation, student empowerment. As long as I taught in other countries, I never could connect evaluation with student empowerment. I thought that was always because when we were evaluated, it and the places where I studied, it wasn't student oriented, it was professor oriented. They would go over the roster, they would check the background history of a student in other classes, and they would say that I want this student or I don't want this student. And in US, I learned early on in Houston Community College when I told my department chair, these three students, you can take them out of my class and put them in other professors. And of course, we learn. And we are taught to teach, we are paid to teach students, but end up learning for free from them. And she said, Dr. Sharma, we can't do that. You have to deal with them. I'm like, excuse me? I had never heard of that in other countries because it was a different setup. So that was interesting, but it was a great learning experience for me. And I started thinking how belligerent to be able to just pick and say, oh, I don't want the rest. And I am so embarrassed how I even dared say that. But didn't come here with that mindset. I came from some different experiences that played a role. So being fair, and then this equity, sensitive assessment methods, traditional assessment approaches may have their advantages, disadvantages, especially for the students from diverse cultural backgrounds. I have had many students from different countries who have never created a presentation. And I think about my first presentation in US. I always had a TA who would create it. I never did. So Houston Community College, right before that, I rushed to the IT professor's office and I begged them to teach me how to make a PowerPoint. And he was so kind, he was so magnanimous. He took all the time and walked me through that. And I got so carried away. And I was so unprofessional my first presentation because the words were fading and there were waves as they would show up. There would be a little tingly noise and there was claps after every single slide because I had never seen all that. So I incorporated everything he taught me in one presentation. And geez, what a mess it was. But my students, they accepted it. Nobody said anything. It's my self reflection. I thought, what was I creating back in the day? So, taking a moment, thinking about the validity of assessment, authentic assessment, allowing our students to draw on their background, their cultural knowledge, their perspectives, their unique skill set, how it would help us create a more engaging, motivating assessment environment by connecting students to their own cultural realities. So motivating them, engaging them, and finally, of course, self reflection plays a big role when it comes to our growth. Thank you for the next slide. It is re envisioning the world, various global issues, and it's not just people looking different, it's people thinking different. It is all sorts of other layers that we might not have thought of. So I have had students from South Africa write about wealth inequality. Right now, I have a student, she is working on the hostile architecture. Um, and it talks about the public places, how they should be designed to promote inclusivity, accessibility, and safety. And then she especially is talking about London's approach to defensive urban design, how it has sparked this public debate, criticism, and the city implemented measures as anti homeless spikes, curved, divided benches so that nobody can lay there, or the armrest, discouraging them from sleeping or loitering. uh, well, some places in US, my students compared to that was San Francisco, Los Angeles, where measures like these anti-homeless spikes, or metal railings or divided benches. Child labor in Nepal. We always remember Nepal as Himalayas, and how that's shared Mount Everest between India and Nepal. But the child labor there is rampant. And just to the point you go get yourself a cup of coffee and there's a 6-year-old serving you, it just melts your heart. And I remember even back in the day, whether I could afford or not, I would ask them, "Did you eat yet?" And that is ingrained in me now. I go to the restaurants here, and first thing I would ask the server is, "Did you eat?" And sometimes it might sound weird. And then my daughter said, "Why are you weird, mom? Why do you ask them?" And then I have to tell them, yes, I have to remind myself I am in US, and probably asking this question, "Did you eat?" Doesn't work well. So whether it's inflation or healthcare, I have a Yemeni student talking about the healthcare humanitarian crisis ongoing due to the conflict, which has impacted healthcare system, damaged facilities, disrupted supply chain, or poverty, or gender equality, or prejudice, or whether it's flooding in India during monsoon seasons, or earthquake in Turkey, or war-torn Ukraine. We have many scholars from Ukraine that study in our university. Or the latest one, I have a student right now in the process of writing about passengers getting weighed before embarking on the plane, or deforestation in Malaysia, or human rights in China or Iran. So just amalgamation of all these different problems and flavors, how it adds to the class. My students had never heard of dowry. So when we talked about this arranged marriage, and that too because a student came from there and was going had to go back to India to get married to somebody his parents chose for him, and that's when this came up. So why there's gender supremacy in some communities, why they don't want girls. And then I shared with them, because when a girl is given away in marriage, tons of dowry is given. Sometimes parents have to refinance their house or sell parts of property just to be able to afford the dowry. So because of that, certain communities, they are to the point they don't want girls. And India most of, well, predominantly vegetarians won't eat chicken, but have no problem getting sixth or seventh abortion because it's a, and just last year, I think I read that abortions are illegal now. And I'm like, how great, that is wonderful. I have students talking about Japan. I have one particular girl, she is deployed in Okinawa, the hub, and the aging population, the work culture, the economic stagnation, and also how the regional revitalization is required, uh, digital transformation, cybersecurity, or housing crisis in Dublin, or the impact of Brexit in Ireland. So just tons of, and I think, it really changes the flavor of class where I remember my very first council meeting and somebody was complaining they can't find their cat. And that was a big problem. And I am a pet lover, so I understand. And then I told them the last country I was in a council meeting is because a mother-in-law burnt their daughter alive um, due to dowry. So dowry death. I'm like, not saying that any situation is trivial here, but I cannot stop in my mind comparing what harrowing circumstances there were and how parents were crying and saying that they are yet to pay the debt of the wedding, and here their daughter is burnt alive just so that they can recycle their son back in the market and get more dowry, another wedding, another dowry. So some just heart-wrenching topics. I am glad that some of my students do not know. Once in a while, I would have somebody who might, and I really hope that they don't have to know about certain things. So the next slide here um, sheds light on certain more other examples, whether it's Germany facing this task of adapting to digital technologies, or Ireland with the housing crisis, or whether it's a drug trafficking or cartels or inequality, poverty, border issues in Mexico. So just addressing the historical ongoing injustices faced by indigenous people. That's a major challenge right now going on in Canada. So I'm going to go through certain slides quickly. The next one here, identifying certain issues. I've been to Norway, I've been to Dubai, do love to travel. So here, Dubai, this dynamic, rapidly growing city, but it has its set of unique challenges and just fair labor practices. How in 110 degrees, it's not the people from Dubai, it's not the sheikhs, it's the immigrants that are working outside serving. It is not the how initially they would get blisters. So just that sustainability, resource management, infrastructure, traffic congestion, Norway with the integration of immigrants, there's a significant increase that presents challenges of its own kind: language acquisition, employment opportunities, or even the social cohesion, regional disparities that might be there. So just slew of different topics, whether it's youth unemployment or high debt in Italy. I remember when Corona happened, a professor, my friend that teaches in Milano, and she said, for 3 months, we don't have to worry about paying electricity or any of the bills. The government would take care of it. And I thought that was wonderful. But what I didn't realize was that after that, they had to pay it back. And Of course. So the next one talks about this little journey of my students from mess to masterpiece, how this Bildungsroman, how they are protagonists for me, how they go through this little discovery, this personal growth, this wisdom, and how the conflicts, the challenges, how they navigate through that. As a professor of English, I used to, for my on-site classes, love the diagnostic writing day one, and then the last day, their final paper. And I would do this comparison and feel so good about the pedagogical strategies used. But it's not me, it's the students. It's what they did. And you can see a stark difference between the first draft and the last one. So this takes us to the next one where I remind my students we are one team, one fight. Whether it's talking about ethnic minorities in Xinjiang or Falun Gong or fixing Cape Town the slum area, whatever it is, human rights advocacy, or whether we have to have economic pressure to or sanctions to get whatever taken care of or work on the infrastructure. So just different ideas. And that takes me to the penultimate slide here. And
Yeah,
the
yeah, Dr. Sharma, we are out of time here, so we need to wrap this up.
Okay, perfect. Well, so I would leave you with this last thought to let us reflect, introspect by considering how we may influence our teaching by adding this global dimension, and how this introspection can create a foundation for embracing bigger scope and being open to new perspectives by fostering a community of support. Thank you. Thank you so much.
That was awesome. And just speaking for me, if you ever choose to write about your experiences, I think a lot of people would be inspired by it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.